They say the show must go on, but what if the show starts playing you? In this video, we delve into an unforgettable night shift at a radio station where the unexplained became undeniable. Prepare for a journey into a world where the airwaves transmit more than just music, and the lines between reality and the truly bizarre vanish before your very ears. My name is Dylan Torres, and for 3 years, I worked the graveyard shift at KTX 94.7, a small radio station nestled in the heart of East Texas. The building itself was nothing remarkable from the outside. A squat, brick structure surrounded by towering pine trees that seemed to lean inward, as if trying to peer through the windows. But inside those walls, something far more sinister lurked in the shadows between the commercial breaks. The first thing you notice when you step into KTX at 2 in the morning is the silence. Not the peaceful kind of quiet that comes with a sleeping world, but an oppressive, heavy silence that seems to press against your eardrums. The kind of quiet that makes you question whether you've gone deaf, until the ancient air conditioning unit kicks in with a wheeze that sounds disturbingly like labored breathing. I remember my first night vividly. The previous DJ, a weathered man named Jimmy Castellanos, who had worked there for over a decade, was showing me the ropes. His hands shook slightly as he pointed out the various controls, and I noticed how he kept glancing over his shoulder, as if expecting someone, or something, to materialize behind us. "Kid," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "this place has its own personality. You'll learn that soon enough." He paused, studying my face in the dim glow of the equipment lights. Some nights, the station runs itself. Other nights, he trailed off, shaking his head. "Well, you'll see." The studio itself was a cramped space filled with outdated equipment that somehow still functioned. The mixing board was a relic from the 1980s, its faders worn smooth by countless hands. Above it, a collection of microphones hung like metallic spiders from the ceiling, their cables creating an intricate web of black wires. The walls were lined with foam padding that had yellowed with age, giving the room a sickly, jaundiced appearance under the fluorescent lights. But it was the smell that truly unsettled me. Beneath the expected odors of old electronics and stale coffee lingered something else, something organic and unpleasant, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. I mentioned it to Jimmy, but he just shrugged and said I'd get used to it. I never did. My first week passed without incident, unless you count the way the coffee maker would turn itself on at exactly 3:17 a.m. every morning, brewing a fresh pot despite being unplugged. I convinced myself it was some kind of timer malfunction, even though unplugged machines don't typically brew coffee. The mind has a remarkable ability to rationalize the impossible when faced with something it cannot understand. The trouble began on my 8th night. I was settling into my routine, queuing up the overnight playlist, and preparing for what I expected to be another uneventful shift. The station played classic rock during the late hours, catering to the insomniacs, night shift workers, and long-haul truckers who formed our nocturnal audience. I'd grown comfortable with the familiar rhythm of the job. Play 3 songs, do a weather update, maybe take a call or 2 from lonely listeners seeking connection in the small hours. At 2:47 a.m., while Leonard Skinner's Free Bird filled the airwaves, I heard it for the first time, a whisper that seemed to come from inside the walls themselves. It was so faint, I initially dismissed it as the building settling. But as I sat in the rolling chair that had molded itself to Jimmy's form over the years, I realized the whisper had a cadence, a rhythm that suggested actual words. I pressed my ear against the foam-covered wall, straining to make out what was being said. The whisper seemed to move, traveling along the wall like water through pipes. But pipes don't usually carry voices that sound like they're pleading for something just out of reach. "Hello," I called softly, feeling foolish even as the word left my lips. The whisper stopped abruptly, leaving behind a silence so complete it made my ears ring. For several minutes, I sat frozen, every nerve ending alert for any sign of the voice's return. When nothing happened, I tried to convince myself it had been my imagination, the product of too much caffeine and too little sleep. But then I noticed the temperature had dropped. The thermostat on the wall still read 72 degrees, exactly where Jimmy had told me to keep it, but my breath began forming small clouds in front of my face. I pulled my jacket tighter around my shoulders and checked the air conditioning unit. It wasn't running. The cold intensified over the next hour, turning my small workspace into what felt like a walk-in freezer. I could see my breath with every exhalation, and my fingers grew stiff as I tried to operate the equipment. Yet somehow, the music continued to play normally, as if the frigid air existed in a pocket that didn't affect the electronics. At 4:15 a.m., just as I was beginning to think the strange incident was over, every light in the studio began to flicker in perfect unison. Not the random strobing you might expect from faulty wiring, but a deliberate, rhythmic pulsing that seemed almost like Morse code. The flickering continued for exactly 30 seconds before stopping abruptly, leaving me in the steady glow of the equipment lights. I made detailed notes of everything that had happened, including the exact times and duration of each event. Call it journalist instinct or simple paranoia, but I had a feeling I was going to need documentation for what was to come. As I wrote, I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being watched, not by security cameras or hidden observers, but by something that existed just beyond the edge of perception. The sun was beginning to rise when my replacement, Amanda Rodriguez, arrived for the morning shift. She took one look at my pale face and raised an eyebrow. "Rough night?" she asked, settling her coffee mug on the counter. I want to tell her about the whispers, the cold, the flickering lights, but something held me back. Maybe it was the fear that she'd think I was losing my mind, or maybe it was the growing suspicion that whatever was happening at KTX was meant to be experienced rather than explained. Instead, I simply nodded and gathered my things. "Jimmy left some notes for you," Amanda said, pulling a folded piece of paper from the desk drawer. "Said you'd need them eventually." I unfolded the paper with trembling fingers. In Jimmy's careful handwriting were 3 simple rules. 1. Never turn off all the lights, no matter how late it gets. 2. Don't respond to knocks on the studio door after midnight. 3. Keep the producer's chair empty, always. Below the rules, in red ink that seemed to pulse in the fluorescent light, was a single sentence that would haunt me for years to come. "They've been waiting for someone new." As I drove home through the early morning mist, I couldn't help but wonder what I'd gotten myself into. The rational part of my mind insisted that there had to be logical explanations for everything I'd experienced. But deep down, in the part of my consciousness that still believed in monsters under the bed and things that go bump in the night, I knew I was dealing with something far beyond the realm of normal experience. The next evening, as I prepared to return to KTX for my second week of night shifts, I found myself studying Jimmy's rules with new understanding. These weren't suggestions or quirky workplace traditions. They were survival instructions. And something told me I was going to need every one of them. What I didn't know then was that my real education at KTX 94.7 was just beginning. The whispers, the cold, the flickering lights, those were just the station's way of saying hello. The true horror was still waiting in the shadows, patient as death and twice as hungry. The piece of paper with Jimmy's rules became my Bible during those first few weeks at KTX. I kept it taped to the edge of the mixing board where I could see it at all times, a constant reminder that I was operating in territory governed by laws I didn't understand. But it wasn't until my 3rd week that I began to comprehend just how crucial those rules were, and what happened to people who broke them. Rule number 1 seemed the most straightforward: never turn off all the lights. The studio was equipped with multiple lighting systems: overhead fluorescents, desk lamps, equipment indicators, and emergency lighting. Jimmy had emphasized that at least one source of illumination must remain on at all times, even during brief bathroom breaks. I'd initially assumed this was a safety precaution, a way to prevent accidents in an equipment-heavy environment. I was wrong. It was during my 15th night that I discovered the true purpose of the lighting rule. I'd been fighting a persistent headache, and the harsh fluorescent lights were making it worse. Around 3:30 a.m., I made what I thought was a harmless decision to dim the overhead lights while keeping the desk lamp on. The moment the fluorescence clicked off, the temperature in the studio plummeted so rapidly that frost began forming on the inside of the windows. But the cold was nothing compared to what emerged from the corners of the room. Shadows began moving independently of any light source, flowing like thick liquid across the walls and ceiling. They weren't random shapes, but seemed to have purpose, reaching toward me with what I can only describe as desperate hunger. The whispers returned, but now they came from multiple directions, overlapping into a chorus of urgent, unintelligible pleas. I fumbled for the light switch, my fingers numb with cold and terror. The moment the fluorescence blazed back to life, the shadows retreated like water down a drain, and the whispers faded to nothing. But for those 30 seconds of darkness, I had glimpsed something that shouldn't exist, something that lived in the spaces between light and shadow, waiting for an invitation to emerge. That night, I called Jimmy at home. It was 4 a.m., but he answered on the second ring, as if he'd been expecting my call. "You dimmed the lights, didn't you?" he said before I could speak. "How did you?" Same thing happened to me my first month. Nearly quit that very night. His voice carried the weight of old memories. "The darkness here isn't empty, Dylan. It's full of things that used to be people." The second rule proved equally important, though it took longer for me to understand why. Don't respond to knocks on the studio door after midnight. During my first month, I heard these knocks frequently, sometimes soft and tentative, other times urgent and demanding. They followed no pattern I could discern, occurring anywhere from 1 a.m. to 5 a.m., always when I was alone in the building. The first time it happened, my instinct was to check who was there. I made it halfway to the door when Jimmy's rule stopped me cold. Something about the way the knock sounded, too measured, too deliberate, set off every alarm bell in my mind. I pressed my ear to the door, but heard nothing on the other side. No footsteps, no breathing, no indication of human presence. Just silence, followed by another series of knocks that seemed to come from inside the door itself. I learned the significance of this rule from Amanda, who'd worked the evening shift for 5 years before I arrived. She told me about her predecessor, a DJ named Rachel Vega, who'd worked the midnight shift before Jimmy took over. Rachel had been known for her friendly demeanor and open-door policy. She'd often invite listeners to stop by the station for impromptu interviews or just a chat. One night, Rachel heard knocking and, thinking it was a regular listener, opened the door without checking first. According to the security footage, she stepped outside to greet whoever was there and simply vanished. The camera showed the door opening, Rachel stepping into the parking lot, and then nothing, as if she'd walked into a wall of invisible fog. Her car was still in the parking lot the next morning, keys in the ignition, purse on the passenger seat. She was never seen again. "The thing is," Amanda said, her voice dropping to a whisper, the security footage from that night shows something else. After Rachel disappeared, the knocking continued for another 3 hours. But by then, there was no one out there to make the sound. The third rule was the most mysterious: keep the producer's chair empty. In most radio stations, the producer's chair is where the show's producer sits to monitor the broadcast, screen calls, and assist the DJ. At KTX, this chair, a worn leather office chair positioned directly behind the DJ's seat, remained perpetually unoccupied, even when we desperately needed the extra workspace. I'd asked Jimmy about this rule multiple times, but he always deflected the question with vague warnings about respecting the previous occupant. It wasn't until I'd been working at KTX for over a month that I learned the chair's history from an unlikely source. Mrs. Eleanor Hutchins, an elderly woman who called the station every night at exactly 3:33 a.m. Mrs. Hutchins claimed to have worked at KTX in the 1970s, back when it was a different kind of station entirely. According to her, the building had housed a small independent radio station that specialized in late-night talk radio and supernatural programming. The producer's chair had belonged to a man named Victor Holloway, who'd served as the station's overnight producer for nearly a decade. Victor was obsessed with the paranormal, Mrs. Hutchins told me during one of our nightly calls. He believed the station was built on some kind of spiritual crossroads, a place where the living and the dead could communicate through radio waves. He spent years trying to make contact with the other side, adjusting frequencies, modifying equipment, conducting what he called ethereal interviews. According to Mrs. Hutchins, Victor's experiments had grown increasingly dangerous as he pushed the boundaries between the physical and spiritual worlds. He'd started staying at the station for days at a time, rarely leaving his chair, convinced he was on the verge of a breakthrough that would revolutionize human understanding of life after death. One morning, the station manager found Victor sitting in his chair, apparently asleep. But when they tried to wake him, they discovered he wasn't breathing. The coroner's report listed the cause of death as cardiac arrest, but there were no signs of heart disease. Victor appeared to have simply stopped living. That chair has been empty ever since, Mrs. Hutchins concluded. Some say Victor's still sitting there, still trying to tune into frequencies that shouldn't exist. Others believe he finally succeeded in crossing over and doesn't want to give up his connection to this world. Either way, nobody who's tried to use that chair has lasted more than a week at the station. I began paying closer attention to the chair after that conversation. During quiet moments between songs, I found myself glancing over my shoulder at it, and I could swear I sometimes saw it moving slightly, as if someone was shifting their weight or adjusting their position. The leather creaked occasionally, despite the fact that no one was sitting on it. More disturbing were the nights when I felt someone watching me work. It wasn't the vague sensation of being observed that I'd experienced before, but the specific feeling of having someone directly behind me, studying my every move. During these episodes, the hair on the back of my neck would stand up, and I'd catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision. Always behind me, always just out of direct sight. One night, emboldened by curiosity and frustrated by weeks of unexplained phenomena, I set up a small mirror on the mixing board, angled so I could watch the producer's chair while appearing to focus on my work. What I saw nearly made me quit on the spot. For most of the night, the chair remained empty, exactly as it should have been. But at 3:33 a.m., the exact time Mrs. Hutchins always called, a figure began materializing in the chair. It wasn't a sudden appearance, but a gradual manifestation, like a photograph slowly developing. The figure was male, middle-aged, wearing what appeared to be 1970s-era clothing. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken, but intensely focused on something I couldn't see. The figure's mouth moved constantly, as if he were speaking or singing along to music only he could hear. His hands gestured at equipment that was no longer there, adjusting dials and sliders that existed only in his memory. For exactly 1 hour, this phantom producer worked his invisible shift, completely oblivious to my presence. At 4:33 a.m., he began to fade, dissolving like smoke until only the empty chair remained. But just before he disappeared completely, he turned and looked directly at me through the mirror. His eyes were filled with a desperate urgency, and his mouth formed words I couldn't hear, but somehow understood. Don't let them through. That was the night I realized Jimmy's rules weren't just guidelines for surviving the night shift at KTX. They were containment protocols, designed to keep something from escaping into our world. The shadows that lived in the darkness, the entities that knocked on doors, the phantom producer who refused to leave his post. They were all part of something larger, something that had been building for decades. And I was beginning to suspect that my arrival at KTX wasn't the coincidence I'd originally believed. Something had been waiting for a new night shift DJ, someone young and naive enough to make the kind of mistakes that would weaken the barriers between worlds. The question wasn't whether I was in danger. It was whether everyone else was in danger because of me. As my second month at KTX began, I made a decision that would change everything. I started keeping detailed records of every anomalous event, every whisper, every cold spot, every flicker of light. If I was going to be part of whatever was happening at the station, I was going to understand it. But understanding, as I would soon learn, comes with a price that not everyone is prepared to pay. The rules have kept me safe so far, but rules are only effective if you know why they exist. And the deeper I dug into the history of KTX 94.7, the more I realized that safety was always temporary, and that some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. By my 6th week at KTX, I'd become obsessed with documentation. My apartment was transformed into a makeshift research center, with walls covered in timelines, frequency charts, and photographs of unexplained phenomena. I'd invested in a digital recorder capable of capturing sounds beyond normal human hearing, and I'd begun bringing it to work every night, determined to gather evidence of what was happening in that studio. The breakthrough came during my 38th night on the job. I'd positioned the recorder near the producer's chair while maintaining my usual post at the mixing board. Around 2:15 a.m., while playing a lengthy drum solo from Minigeta Vita, I noticed the studio's ambient noise had changed. The usual hum of electronics had been joined by something else, a low-frequency vibration that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. I checked the recorder's display and saw something that made my blood run cold. The device was detecting audio in ranges far below human hearing, patterns of sound that registered as organized communication rather than random noise. But more disturbing was what happened when I used the recorder's frequency shift feature to bring these ultra-low sounds into the audible range. Voices, dozens of them, all speaking at once in overlapping conversations that seemed to span decades. I could make out fragments, weather reports from the 1980s, commercial jingles from products that no longer existed, and DJ patter and styles that had gone out of fashion before I was born. It was as if the station's entire broadcasting history had been somehow recorded in the building structure, playing back on a frequency just beyond perception. But these weren't simple recordings. The voices responded to current events, incorporating details from recent news stories and making references to songs I played earlier in my shift. Whatever these entities were, they were aware of the present moment, even as they seemed trapped in the station's past. The most chilling discovery came when I isolated one particular voice, a woman speaking in the professional cadence of a news anchor. At first, her words seemed like standard broadcast copy, but as I listened more carefully, I realized she was delivering news reports about events that hadn't happened yet. She spoke matter-of-factly about accidents, weather patterns, and local incidents that wouldn't occur for several days. I started keeping a log of these future broadcasts, cross-referencing them with actual news as it unfolded. The accuracy rate was terrifying. Nearly 80% of the predicted events came to pass exactly as described by the phantom newscaster. It was as if time itself flowed differently inside KTX, allowing glimpses of events that existed in probability rather than reality. The visual phenomena proved equally disturbing to document. I'd brought a night vision camera to capture the shadow movements that occurred whenever the lights dimmed, and what I discovered challenged everything I thought I knew about the nature of light and darkness. The shadows weren't simply the absence of illumination. They were entities with mass and intent, moving through the studio like underwater creatures navigating an invisible ocean. The camera revealed details invisible to the naked eye. The shadows had texture, a rippling quality that suggested liquid rather than void. They formed recognizable shapes, human silhouettes, faces in profile, reaching hands. They maintained their form for several seconds before dissolving back into the general darkness. Most unnervingly, they seemed aware of the camera, occasionally moving directly toward the lens as if trying to communicate. One night, while reviewing footage from the previous week, I noticed something that made me question my own sanity. In several frames, the shadows appear to be writing, their movements forming letters and words and languages I didn't recognize. I took screenshots of these shadow writings and spent hours researching their potential meaning. What I found kept me awake for 3 straight days. The symbols matched no known alphabet, but they bore striking resemblances to pictographs found in ancient burial chambers, symbols associated with communication between the living and the dead. According to my research, these markings had appeared in various cultures throughout history, always in places where the boundary between worlds had grown thin. Amanda became my reluctant assistant in documenting the station's anomalies. Initially skeptical of my claims, she'd started staying late occasionally to help with equipment maintenance, and during these extended visits, she'd begun experiencing phenomena herself. Her first encounter with the unexplained came during what should have been a routine task, replacing the batteries in the emergency exit signs. I was up on the stepladder, working on the sign above the studio door. She told me the next morning, her voice shaking slightly. "I could hear you doing the weather report, but underneath your voice there was something else. It sounded like interference at first, but then I realized it was another voice, someone else giving a completely different weather report." According to Amanda, this second voice had been delivering a forecast for a city that didn't exist, describing weather patterns for a place called New Sanctum that experienced temperatures and ranges impossible for any terrestrial location. The phantom meteorologist had spoken with the same professional authority as any real forecaster, but his predictions included phenomena like spectral precipitation and temporal wind shifts. The worst part, Amanda continued, was that I could hear both broadcasts simultaneously, as if they were occupying the same frequency, but existing in different realities. And when I looked down at you in the studio, you were still giving the normal forecast, completely unaware of the other voice. We began conducting experiments, testing the boundaries of the station's supernatural properties. We discovered that certain actions triggered increased activity, moving equipment to different positions, adjusting the transmitter frequency, or simply acknowledging the phenomena out loud seemed to strengthen their manifestation. It was as if our attention itself was feeding whatever lived within Tex's walls. The most significant discovery came when we found Victor Holloway's hidden equipment. While exploring the station's basement, a cramped space filled with obsolete broadcasting equipment and forgotten files, Amanda discovered a false wall behind a stack of old transmitter parts. Beyond this wall was a small room that wasn't shown on any building plans, containing electronic equipment unlike anything either of us had ever seen. Victor's secret laboratory was a maze of modified radio components connected by cables and configurations that seemed to defy basic electrical principles. Multiple transmitters had been linked together and tuned to frequencies that shouldn't exist, creating what appeared to be a communication array designed to broadcast on wavelengths that existed between standard radio bands. In the center of this electronic maze sat a recording device that was still running after more than 40 years. Its tape reels moved constantly, capturing audio from sources we couldn't identify. When we played back portions of the tape, we heard conversations between Victor and entities that claimed to be deceased former employees of various radio stations across Texas. These beings provided detailed information about their deaths, their lingering connection to broadcasting equipment, and their desperate attempts to warn the living about what was coming. The frequencies are thinning. One voice explained in a recording dated 3 days before Victor's death. Each broadcast weakens the membrane between worlds. Soon, we won't need equipment to cross over. Soon, we'll be able to walk through directly. Victor's own voice responded with a mixture of excitement and terror. Is that what you want? To return to physical existence? Not return, the entity corrected. Expand. Your world has forgotten us, but we remember everything. And we're so very hungry to experience sensation again. The conversation continued for hours, revealing a complex hierarchy among the dead broadcasters. Some entities seemed benevolent, offering warnings about the dangers of interdimensional communication. Others spoke with barely contained malevolence about their plans to use radio waves as bridges into our reality. All of them agreed on one point. The barriers between worlds were weakening, and KTX was the focal point of this deterioration. Amanda and I spent 3 weeks transcribing Victor's tapes, building a comprehensive picture of what had been happening at the station for decades. The phenomena we'd experienced weren't random haunting, but part of a deliberate campaign by entities seeking permanent access to our world. Every night shift DJ, every engineer, every staff member who'd worked alone in the building had unknowingly contributed to this effort simply by maintaining the station's operations. The most disturbing revelation came in Victor's final recording, made just hours before his death. His voice was barely recognizable, strained by exhaustion and terror. They've been lying to me. The communication experiments, the friendly conversations, it was all manipulation. They don't want to just talk to the living. They want to replace us. I've opened a door that can't be closed, and now they're coming through whether I help them or not. The new DJ, whoever takes this shift next, needs to understand. The rules aren't protection. They're a delaying tactic, and time is running out. That recording ended with the sound of Victor's final heartbeat, captured by equipment sensitive enough to detect the cessation of life itself. But underneath that sound was something else. A chorus of triumphant voices celebrating their first successful crossover from death to life. As Amanda and I sat in Victor's hidden laboratory, surrounded by 40 years of documentation about interdimensional communication, we realized we were facing a problem far beyond our ability to solve. The entities weren't just haunting KTX. They were using it as a beachhead for an invasion that had been building for decades. And according to Victor's calculations, the process was accelerating. Each night's shift brought them closer to achieving permanent physical manifestation. The question was no longer whether they would succeed in crossing over completely, but whether anyone would be left alive to witness it when they did. That night, as I prepared for what I now knew might be my final shift at KTX 94.7, I made a decision that would either save countless lives or damn us all. I was going to break the rules. Every single one of them. Because sometimes the only way to stop a disaster is to trigger it yourself, under controlled conditions, before it can happen naturally. What I didn't realize was that the entities had been waiting for exactly this kind of decision. They'd spent 40 years grooming night shift DJs, pushing them toward the moment when desperation would overcome caution. And now, finally, they have found someone foolish enough to give them exactly what they needed. The decision to deliberately break all of Jimmy's rules didn't come easily. For 3 days, I wrestled with the implications of what I was planning, knowing that once I crossed that threshold, there would be no returning to the relative safety of ignorance. But Victor's final recording had made one thing clear. The rules were never meant to stop the entities, only to slow them down until they found someone desperate enough to help them complete their crossing. I chose Saturday night for my experiment. Weekend shifts were typically slower, with fewer callers and minimal management presence, which would give me the privacy I needed for what I was about to attempt. I arrived at KTX at 11 p.m., 3 hours before my usual start time, carrying a duffel bag filled with recording equipment, cameras, and what I hoped would be adequate protection against entities that might view physical laws as suggestions rather than absolutes. Amanda had begged me not to go through with the plan, but she'd also agreed to monitor everything from her apartment using the station's emergency communication system. If things went wrong, and we both suspected they would. She would call the police, the fire department, and anyone else who might be able to help. Though neither of us was sure what kind of help would be effective against beings that existed primarily as electromagnetic phenomena. The first rule I broke was the lighting requirement. At exactly midnight, I systematically shut off every light source in the studio except for the small red recording indicator on the mixing board. The darkness that followed wasn't gradual. It was instantaneous and absolute, as if the shadows had been waiting just beyond the reach of the lights, ready to flood the space the moment they were given permission. The temperature drop was immediate and severe. My breath began forming clouds within seconds, and frost started accumulating on the metal surfaces of the equipment. But the cold was nothing compared to what emerged from the darkness around me. The shadows came alive with purposeful movement, flowing across walls and ceiling like liquid mercury. But these weren't the tentative manifestations I'd observed before. These shadows had substance, mass, and clear intent. They moved toward me with deliberate hunger, reaching out with appendages that felt solid when they brushed against my skin. The whispers returned as a full chorus now, no longer requiring electronic equipment to amplify them into audibility. Dozens of voices spoke in overlapping conversations, sharing information about their deaths, their years of waiting, and their plans for what would come next. I heard Victor's voice among them, but it was different now, hollow and desperate, warning me to restore the lights before it was too late. They lied to me. His voice pleaded from somewhere in the darkness around me, said they just wanted to communicate, but they don't want to talk. They want to take over. Turn the lights back on before they finish crossing over. But I was committed to the experiment. I needed to understand the full scope of what we were dealing with, even if it meant risking my life in the process. I activated my recording equipment and began documenting everything, speaking aloud my observations while the shadows pressed closer with each passing minute. At 12:33 a.m., I implemented the second rule violation. I opened the studio door and stepped outside. The parking lot was empty, as expected, but the silence that greeted me was unlike anything in my experience. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the presence of something that actively consumed sound, creating a void where even the memory of noise couldn't exist. The knocking began immediately, but not from outside the building as I'd anticipated. The knocks came from inside the studio. I just left, rhythmic and insistent, as if something was trying to get out rather than in. I realized with growing horror that by opening the door from the inside, I might have reversed the normal flow of entities. Instead of keeping things out, I was now trapping something in with my equipment. I rushed back into the studio to find the shadows had become more aggressive in my absence. They were no longer content to simply reach toward me, but were actively trying to pull me into areas of deeper darkness where I suspected I would cease to exist in any meaningful way. The phantom voices had organized themselves into what sounded like a planning session, discussing strategies for corporeal integration and permanent manifestation. The third rule violation was the most difficult to implement. Sitting in Victor's chair required overcoming every instinct for self-preservation I possessed. The leather was ice cold against my skin, but worse than the physical discomfort was the immediate sense of invasion that accompanied occupying the seat. Something else was already there, something that didn't appreciate sharing space with a living person. The moment I settled into the chair, Victor's consciousness flooded into mine. For several terrifying minutes, I experienced his memories as if they were my own, years of late-night experiments, growing obsession with interdimensional communication, and a gradual realization that he'd become a willing collaborator in something far more dangerous than he'd imagined. Through Victor's memories, I learned the truth about Kex's founding. The station had been built on the site of a much older structure, a telegraph station from the 1920s that had been destroyed in a fire that killed 12 operators. The electromagnetic properties of the location had been enhanced by this tragedy, creating a natural focal point for entities seeking to cross between dimensions. But the fire hadn't been accidental. It had been deliberately set by someone who discovered what the telegraph operators were really doing in their isolated station. They hadn't just been sending and receiving messages. They'd been communicating with the dead, using telegraph equipment to bridge the gap between life and death. The arsonist had tried to destroy this connection, but instead had only strengthened it, trapping the operator's consciousness in the electromagnetic field that permeated the site. Every radio station built on the location since then had experienced similar phenomena, and each had contributed to the growing power of the entities seeking to return to physical existence. KTX was simply the latest in a long line of facilities that had unknowingly served as doorways between worlds. As Victor's memories continued to flow through me, I began to understand the true purpose of the rules. They hadn't been designed to protect the staff. They'd been created to maintain optimal conditions for the entity's gradual manifestation. The lights kept the shadows concentrated in specific areas where they could gather strength. The closed door prevented their energy from dissipating into the outside world. And the empty chair served as an anchor point for Victor's consciousness, allowing him to coordinate the crossing process from the other side. I had walked directly into a trap that had been 40 years in the making. The realization came with a surge of panic that nearly drove me from the chair, but Victor's presence held me in place with supernatural strength. Through our shared consciousness, he showed me what was really happening in the studio around us. The shadows weren't random manifestations. They were former radio personalities, engineers, and staff members from stations across Texas, all drawn to KTX by the promise of return to physical existence. But the process required a living host, someone whose consciousness could be gradually displaced by the accumulated dead. Every night shift DJ who had worked at KTX had unknowingly been auditioned for this role, their reactions to the supernatural phenomena serving as tests of their suitability for possession. I had passed every test with flying colors, demonstrating exactly the right combination of curiosity, bravery, and desperation that the entities needed. "You have to fight them," Victor's voice whispered directly into my mind. I thought I could control the process, but they're too strong. They've been feeding off electromagnetic energy for decades, growing more powerful with each broadcast. If they complete the crossing using your body, they'll have access to the entire radio network. Every station, every frequency, they'll be able to spread across the airwaves like a virus. The studio around me began to change as the entity's power increased. Equipment that had been obsolete for decades flickered back to life, broadcasting on frequencies that shouldn't exist. The walls became translucent, revealing layers of past incarnations. I could see the original telegraph station underneath Tex's modern facade, its operators still hunched over their equipment, tapping out messages to recipients who had been dead for nearly a century. At 1:17 a.m., the manifestation process accelerated dramatically. The shadows began consolidating, forming more solid shapes that moved with increasing coordination. I watched in horror as phantom broadcasters took their positions at equipment that existed in multiple time periods simultaneously. They were preparing for something, a final broadcast that would serve as a mass summoning, calling every dead radio personality in Texas to join them at KTX. Through the window, I saw cars pulling into the parking lot, but these weren't ordinary vehicles. They were spectral automobiles from different decades, carrying the spirits of DJs, news anchors, and radio engineers who had died while on duty. Each arrival strengthened the electromagnetic field around the station, making the boundaries between dimensions increasingly permeable. The phantom broadcasters began their final transmission at exactly 2 a.m., using equipment that existed in past, present, and future simultaneously. They sent out a signal that penetrated every radio in Texas. But this wasn't a normal broadcast. It was an invitation calling to every person who had ever worked in radio, whether they were alive or dead. I felt a pull myself, a compulsion to join the broadcast, to add my voice to the growing chorus of the dead. Victor's consciousness was being overwhelmed by the collective presence of hundreds of deceased broadcasters, each contributing their knowledge and experience to create a hive mind of terrifying power and sophistication. Fighting against the possession required every ounce of willpower I possessed. While phantom voices urged me to surrender to the inevitable, I forced myself to remember why I come to KTX in the first place. Not just for a job, but because I genuinely loved radio, loved the connection it created between broadcaster and listener, loved the intimacy of speaking to people in the darkness who needed to hear a friendly voice. That love became my anchor, keeping my consciousness intact as the entities tried to replace it with their collective hunger. I realized that their fundamental misunderstanding of radio was also their weakness. They saw broadcasting as a means of control, a way to impose their will on the living. But real radio was about connection, about creating community among isolated people who needed to know they weren't alone. Using this insight, I began fighting back in the only way I knew how. I started broadcasting, not to the dead, but to the living. I grabbed the microphone with hands that were rapidly losing sensation as the cold intensified, and began speaking to anyone who might be listening in the early morning darkness of East Texas. This is Dylan Torres at KTX 94.7, and if you're hearing this, you need to know that something impossible is happening right now. My voice came out steady despite the terror I felt. There are forces in this world that exist beyond our understanding, entities that have been waiting decades for the chance to return to physical existence. They're using radio waves as bridges between dimensions, and they're very close to succeeding. The phantom broadcasters reacted with fury to my hijacking of their transmission. Shadows lashed out at me with increasing violence, and the temperature dropped so rapidly that my equipment began malfunctioning. But I continued speaking, drawing strength from the knowledge that somewhere out there, real people were listening to a real person fighting against forces they couldn't see or understand. They wanted to think that death is the end, but it's not. Some people refuse to let go, refuse to move on to whatever comes next. They cling to the frequencies they knew in life, building power over decades until they're strong enough to take what they lost back by force. But they can only succeed if we let them, if we give up our connection to each other and retreat into isolation and fear. The studio began shaking as the entity's rage intensified. Equipment exploded in showers of sparks, and the windows cracked under pressure that seemed to come from inside and outside simultaneously. But my voice continued to reach listeners across Texas, and I could feel their attention like a warm current flowing through the radio waves. Radio has always been about connection. I continued, raising my voice over the supernatural chaos surrounding me. It's about knowing that somewhere out there, another person is sharing this moment with you, listening to the same words, feeling less alone because of that shared experience. The dead can't understand this because they've forgotten what it means to be truly alive, to be part of a community of living, breathing, caring human beings. At 2:47 a.m., something unexpected happened. The phone lines began lighting up with calls from listeners across East Texas. People who had been awakened by my broadcast were calling to offer support, to share their own strange experiences, to ask what they could do to help. Their voices, filtered through the station's ancient phone system, created a counter-frequency that interfered with the entity's manifestation process. The phantom broadcasters had expected to face a lone, terrified DJ who would quickly succumb to their collective power. Instead, they found themselves confronting a living network of human consciousness, connected by radio waves, but powered by genuine emotion and mutual concern. For creatures that had spent decades in isolation, this display of spontaneous community was overwhelming. Victor's voice returned to my mind, but now it carried hope instead of despair. They can't maintain cohesion against that many living voices. The connections between the listeners are creating interference in their frequency. Keep them talking. Keep them connected to each other. I spent the next 2 hours facilitating the most unusual talk show in radio history, connecting frightened listeners with others who had experienced similar phenomena, helping isolated people find common ground in their encounters with the supernatural. With each new connection made, the entity's power diminished, their carefully orchestrated invasion dissolving into chaos as their unified consciousness fragmented under the pressure of genuine human community. By 5 a.m., the studio had returned to normal temperature, the shadows had retreated to their usual corners, and the phantom equipment had faded back into memory. The entities weren't destroyed. They were simply overwhelmed, forced back into dormancy by an outpouring of human connection they couldn't counter or comprehend. But I knew this victory was temporary. The dead broadcasters would return, probably stronger and better prepared for resistance. The question was whether the living would be ready for them when they did. The aftermath of that night changed everything, not just for me, but for everyone who had heard the broadcast. In the days following what local media dubbed the KTX incident, the station received hundreds of calls from listeners reporting similar experiences at radio stations across Texas and beyond. It became clear that the phenomenon I'd encountered wasn't isolated to our small East Texas facility, but part of a much larger network of supernatural activity centered around broadcasting equipment. Amanda and I spent the following weeks cataloging these reports, building a comprehensive map of locations where deceased broadcasters had established footholds in our world. The pattern that emerged was both fascinating and terrifying. Nearly every radio station built on a site with a history of electromagnetic communication, whether telegraph offices, early radio stations, or even locations where significant broadcasts had occurred, showed signs of paranormal activity. The entities had been establishing themselves systematically across the entire radio infrastructure, creating a shadow network that paralleled our normal broadcasting system. Each station served as a node in this network, with KTX functioning as a primary hub due to its location on the old telegraph station site and Victor's decades of experimental enhancement. Mrs. Eleanor Hutchins proved to be an invaluable source of information during this research phase. Her nightly calls to the station had continued, but now she revealed information she'd kept hidden for years. She hadn't just worked at KTX in the 1970s. She'd been Victor's assistant, helping him develop the equipment and techniques that had first opened stable communication with the dead. "We thought we were pioneers," she told me during one of our extended conversations. Victor was brilliant, absolutely brilliant, but he was also naive about the motivations of the entities we were contacting. They presented themselves as fellow broadcasters who simply wanted to continue their work after death. It wasn't until much later that we realized they were using our experiments to map the entire radio network, identifying weak points where they could establish permanent footholds. According to Mrs. Hutchins, she left the project just days before Victor's death, finally understanding that their experiments were endangering not just themselves, but potentially everyone who worked in radio. She'd spent the subsequent decades monitoring stations across Texas, documenting manifestations, and trying to warn staff about the dangers they faced. "That night, when you broke the rules," she explained, "I was listening from my apartment, ready to call for help if needed. But when you started connecting those callers to each other, when you turned the broadcast into a community conversation instead of monologue, you did something the entities had never encountered. They prepared for resistance from individuals, but they had no defense against collective human consciousness. The scientific community's response to our documentation was predictably skeptical, but we found unexpected support from researchers studying electromagnetic phenomena and consciousness. Dr. Patricia Vance, a physicist from the University of Texas who specialized in quantum consciousness theories, became particularly interested in our findings. What you're describing aligns with theoretical models of consciousness as an electromagnetic field, she explained during a visit to KTX several weeks after the incident. If human consciousness can exist independently of biological substrate, even temporarily after death, then radio equipment could theoretically serve as an interface for that consciousness to interact with the physical world. Dr. Vance helped us develop better methods for documenting the phenomena, including specialized equipment that could detect and measure the electromagnetic signatures associated with entity manifestations. Her involvement lent credibility to our research and attracted attention from other scientists interested in the intersection of consciousness and electromagnetic fields. But the most significant development came from an unexpected source. Other night shift DJs who had heard about our experience began reaching out with their own stories. We discovered a loose network of broadcasters across the country who had encountered similar phenomena, but had remained silent out of fear of ridicule or job loss. Jake Morrison, who worked the overnight shift at a classic rock station in Austin, had been dealing with phantom callers for over 2 years. They'd call in with requests for songs by artists who died decades ago. But when I tried to take down their information, the line would go dead. Sometimes I'd hear the requested songs playing faintly in the background while I was on air, even though I wasn't playing them. Lisa Chun from a talk radio station in Houston reported regular conversations with a former host who had died of a heart attack in the studio 5 years earlier. He'd give me advice about dealing with difficult callers, warn me about equipment problems before they happened, and sometimes just chat about the old days when radio was more personal. I thought I was losing my mind until I found recordings of his shows from the 1990s and realized he was using the exact same phrases and speech patterns. These testimonials helped us understand that the entities weren't universally malevolent. Many seemed to be former broadcasters who genuinely wanted to help their living counterparts, sharing knowledge and providing guidance based on their accumulated experience. The dangerous ones were those who had become corrupted during their time in the electromagnetic realm, developing an insatiable hunger for physical sensation that drove them to attempt possession of the living. The network of affected DJs became an informal support system, sharing techniques for managing supernatural encounters while maintaining their ability to work effectively. We developed protocols for distinguishing between helpful spirits and potentially dangerous entities, established communication methods that allowed for interaction without risking possession, and created warning systems to alert other stations when particularly aggressive manifestations were detected. Jimmy Castellanos returned to KTX 3 months after the incident, drawn by reports of our research and curious about what had happened at his former workplace. His reaction to our documentation was a mixture of relief and vindication. For 10 years, I felt like I was going crazy, he admitted, reviewing our recordings and photographs. I knew something was wrong with that place, but I couldn't prove it, couldn't explain it to anyone who would take me seriously. I developed those rules through trial and error, learning what seemed to keep the phenomena manageable. But I always knew it was temporary, that eventually someone would either figure out how to stop it permanently or become completely overwhelmed by it. Jimmy's return marked the beginning of a new phase in our relationship with Kex's supernatural residents. Instead of trying to eliminate the entities or simply contain them, we began working toward a form of coexistence that acknowledged their presence while maintaining clear boundaries about acceptable behavior. The process required constant vigilance and regular renegotiation of terms. Some entities, particularly Victor, proved willing to work within established guidelines in exchange for limited opportunities to communicate with the living. Others remained hostile and had to be actively countered using techniques we developed through experimentation and consultation with experts in electromagnetic phenomena. 6 months after that terrible night, when I had broken all the rules, KTX had become something unique in the broadcasting world, a station that openly acknowledged and managed its supernatural residents while continuing to serve its living audience. Our late-night programming had evolved to include a weekly segment called After Hours, where listeners could call in to discuss unexplained experiences and receive guidance from people who understood what they were going through. The show became surprisingly popular, attracting listeners from across the country who felt isolated by their encounters with the paranormal. We provided a forum for people to share their stories without fear of ridicule, connecting them with others who had similar experiences and helping them develop coping strategies for dealing with the supernatural in their daily lives. But success brought new challenges. As Kex's reputation grew, we began attracting attention from entities at other locations who saw our station as a potential gateway to broader influence. Managing these external pressures while maintaining our delicate balance with the local supernatural community required constant adaptation and vigilance. The most disturbing development was the discovery that our broadcasts were being monitored and analyzed by entities at radio stations hundreds of miles away. They were learning from our methods, adapting our techniques for managing human-spirit interaction, and potentially preparing for their own attempts at large-scale manifestation. Dr. Vance's latest research suggested that the phenomenon was accelerating, with electromagnetic disturbances at broadcasting facilities increasing exponentially over the past year. "Whatever you accomplished at KTX," she warned during her most recent visit, "it seems to have awakened something much larger. The entire radio infrastructure is showing signs of increased supernatural activity." As I write this, nearly a year after that night when everything changed, I'm still working the midnight shift at KTX 94.7. But now I'm not alone in the studio. Victor's presence has become a constant companion, his consciousness intertwined with mine in ways that are both comforting and deeply unsettling. He serves as an intermediary between the living and the dead, helping to maintain the fragile peace we've established. The rules I once followed have evolved into something more complex, a constantly negotiated treaty between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. Every night brings new challenges as entities test the boundaries we've established, seeking ways to expand their influence without triggering the kind of collective human response that drove them back during our first confrontation. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I wonder if we've truly solved anything or simply postponed an inevitable reckoning. The dead broadcasters are patient in ways the living can't comprehend, and they're learning from every interaction, every mistake, every small victory we achieve. But then a caller gets through, someone who's been alone with their supernatural experiences, desperate for validation and understanding. When I can connect them with others who've walked the same frightening path, when I can help them realize they're not losing their sanity, but encountering something real and manageable, I remember why this work matters. The airwaves carry more than music and talk shows. They carry human connection, the invisible threads that bind us together across the darkness. The dead may be able to manipulate radio waves, but they can never fully understand or duplicate the living connections that flow through them. That's our advantage, and perhaps our only hope. As long as radio continues to connect real people in real time, sharing genuine emotions and experiences, the living will always have something the dead can never truly possess: the ability to create new connections, new communities, new forms of understanding that transcend the boundaries between life and death. The show goes on, every night, carrying voices across the darkness to people who need to know they're not alone. And maybe, in the end, that's the most powerful frequency of all. To anyone who works the night shift at a radio station and recognizes the phenomena described in this account, you are not alone. The network exists, quietly connecting those who guard the airwaves against forces that seek to corrupt them. Listen carefully to the frequencies between stations. Sometimes, help comes from the most unexpected sources. Remember, the dead can only take what the living surrender willingly. Stay connected to each other. Trust in the power of genuine human community, and never let them convince you that isolation is safer than reaching out. The show must go on, but it's up to us to decide who's really running it.